and welcome back to Mads World. I'm your host Mads, and thank you so much for coming back each week. I'm thrilled to have you here, and if you do enjoy the show, please remember to subscribe, rate and review the podcast, and just tell one friend about it. Imagine if you all told one person, my listens would double, so please help me out. This week I'm joined by British author, feminist campaigner and psychologist Dr. Jessica Taylor. Jess is the founder of VictimFocus, which she describes as a company designed to challenge and change the victim-blaming practices in social care, policing, mental health and support services all over the world. In 2019, Jess completed her PhD in forensic psychology from the University of Birmingham with a thesis titled, Logically, I Know I'm Not to Blame, but I Still Feel to Blame, exploring and measuring victim blaming and self-blame of women who have been subjected to sexual violence. She was later recognised for her contribution to the psychology of victim blaming of women, her work in mental health, and her contribution to feminism by the Royal Society of Arts. In 2020, Jess self-published her thesis as a book titled Why Women Are Blamed for Everything. Based on 3 years of doctoral research and 10 years of practice with women and girls, the book focuses on the reasons why society and individual psychology blames women for male violence committed against them. This year, Jess published her second book, Sexy But Psycho. She described it as a mixture of academic research, history, psychology, and real-life stories of women and girls who have been told that they are mentally ill instead of being listened to. The book focuses on how mental illness has historically been used to discredit women, focusing especially on the 2000s and Britney Spears. In this episode, we talk about the effects of buzzwords like toxic and gaslighting, what terms like toxic masculinity and machismo actually mean, and how this affects men and women independently, and unpacking internalized misogyny. Trigger warning for this episode, we do discuss sexual violence. Hi Jess, how are you?
Good, thank you. You?
I'm really good, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I'm absolutely buzzing to have you. I thought we could start off with just some questions to sort of get to know you and help our listeners understand who you are before we jump into our chat that I've invited you on the podcast for, all about toxic masculinity. So I just want to start off with, what made you want to work in your current field?
Oh, everybody always asks me this, but and I wish I had like a proper origin story, but actually I didn't set out to be a psychologist that specialised in this particular topic. I initially I wanted to go into like neuropsychology, and it was actually through volunteering that I became really interested in this topic. So I didn't have when I was doing my degree, I didn't have enough experience, for example, to get on to the things that I wanted, like most students. So I thought, well, I'll go out and I'm going to try and give my time. I've got some spare hours on a Friday. And so I went to a volunteer centre and said, I've got this time. What is there available that I could do? And they came back to me a couple of days later and said, well, there's this role working in sexual and domestic violence. It's voluntary, and you work in the courtroom and you support the victims as they give their evidence. And I thought,
wow,
well, I've never heard of anything like this. I've never done anything like this. So I decided, I was only 19, so I decided to go and do that. And it was years then of different roles in that sector that made me realise that we were failing so badly, and so many women and girls were being subjected to this behaviour. And that was when I thought, do you know what, I'm going to be a psychologist that focuses on changing that. And so it was, I do have my own personal experience of violence and things like that from when I was younger, but people, I think, make an assumption that that's what led me to do it, but it actually wasn't. It was other women's traumas, and it was the fact that other women were being failed so badly. And I felt like I almost felt like I was colluding with that by working in the court, so I resigned and decided that I wanted to try and change the system. I didn't want to work in it.
Do you know what, you said that you don't have an origin story, but I think that's quite a fantastic origin story. I mean, that's like superhero level origin story, going and, seeing it firsthand. And I think it just goes to show how much empathy you have as well. I mean, how can you not, in being in a situation like that, but wanting to go and volunteer your time and then, extending it out to what you do now with VictimFocus. And I was hoping you could tell our listeners a little bit about VictimFocus and the work you do here. So obviously you founded the organization, but how has that sort of developed, and what are you doing now to support that?
Okay, so VictimFocus is 5.5 years old now. And
Wow.
when I set the company up, I was actually working in national, like, senior management in anti-human trafficking and the sexual
Wow.
exploitation of teenage girls. And again, I just saw so much failure. These girls were being treated terribly, and they were being victim blamed. And, you know, even girls that were being trafficked across the country were still being blamed somehow. I mean, like, you know, I really struggled with that on a day-to-day basis. And I started challenging systems and authorities and giving speeches and writing things. And I noticed that people were just really quite defensive. And I thought, the only way I am going to be able to do this is if I am on my own, because it gives me the freedom to say and do what I need to do without any control from other people or any sort of outside influence. So I set VictimFocus up, and it's just grown and grown and grown. And now what we do is we work internationally, and doing more and more international stuff actually in the last sort of 6 months or so, to challenge poor practice towards women and girls when they've been subjected to trauma, male violence, forms of abuse and oppression. We try to only take on projects where people want actual change. So they're looking for true change. So, for example, we work with a lot of police forces that are looking to address the misogyny in that force, and they want true change. And we create, you know, free research, free reports, resources for women and girls. We do a lot of public speaking, and then through that, I've ended up doing a lot of media. I've written books and things like that. So it's just grown and grown and grown and grown.
That's so impressive. And speaking of books, you had your latest book come out, Sexy But Psycho, earlier in the year, if I'm correct. Can you tell me all about that and tell our listeners about that? And I'll pop a link in the episode description as well, so everyone can go out and grab a copy if they feel like reading it.
Sexy But Psycho, I think, and I still think this is one of, if it might be the most important thing that I ever wrote and ever will write ever for the rest of my life. Like, it was something.
That's a huge statement.
Yeah, no, I think it is. And I remember saying it to my publishers, and I was like, "Sorry, like, this is my peak.
This is the peak."
It's Sexy But Psycho is born from years and years of my experience of working with women and girls when they try to come forward and they try to report abuse and violence and things that they've been through, only to be told that actually they're mentally ill. They have a mental health issue, they've got a personality disorder, they've got bipolar. And this is actually an extremely common experience. So, like, when I was running, you know, sexual violence services, or when I was working in the courts, the majority of women and girls that I came across, even though they'd reported, you know, sexual assault or rape or abuse, domestic abuse, something like that, they had then been told that their responses were, you know, disorders, depression, anxiety, you know, personality disorders and stuff like that. And it got to me, it really got to me over the years. So the book is my way of essentially arguing that we are deliberately pathologizing women and girls and convincing them that they are mentally ill, instead of validating the true trauma of being a woman in a patriarchy where you are likely to be sexually assaulted, catcalled in the street, harassed, you know, abused, raped. Like, these things are very common experiences, but the narrative in society is that they're not common experiences. So if they keep happening to you, there must be something wrong with you. You must be bringing it on yourself, or you must be asking for it, or picking the wrong men over and over again, or whatever it is. So the argument in Sexy But Psycho is actually that we are, as a society, convincing women and girls from an early age that it's all in their head and that they're mentally ill and they need medication and they need therapy.
Yeah, I guess it is kind of like, I hate saying the word gaslighting because it's so overused, and I think it's used incorrectly a lot, but it's almost like professional gaslighting, you know, like from a higher, a more authoritative position, you know, whether that's doctors or whether that's, you know, mental health experts and stuff, convincing women and girls that they're experiencing something that is quite a universal experience for a lot of women, but for some reason the fault of it falls on women rather than external factors, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. So I wrote a post about this once, and I called it Masslighting, because I think it's mass gaslighting of women and girls, like, because it's such a a powerful, systemic, global form of gaslighting, you know, that millions and millions of women and girls are being told they have these disorders that nobody can prove. There's no test for them. There's no brain scan. There's no blood test. You know, it's such a strange experience because you can be told by someone in authority, you have this disorder, and you can't then go, no, I don't. Because they'll say, well, you're denying the diagnosis. You're refusing to engage. Like, well, you know, and in the same way that women will often contact me and say, well, I've told them that I don't think I have personality disorder. I've told them that I've been abused, and I've told them that I don't want to take the medication anymore because I don't think there's anything wrong with me. And then they'll be told, well, that's just evidence of your mental illness, because you would say that, wouldn't you? Yeah. So how do you get out of that? How do you get out of that?
And I wonder if, I'm going to try and articulate this the best way I can, but where do you think, from a professional perspective in terms of doctors, do you think that that's coming from a higher patriarchal level, or their education maybe being taught by more men than women, or maybe more men than women are in these roles telling women these? Like, is it just a combination of all of those things? Like, where do you think it's stemming from that women are being told this, rather than, you know, maybe looking at external factors and seeing why they might have had the experiences that they've had?
It's not sex specific is the first thing. So female psychiatrists are just as likely to tell women they're mentally ill as male psychiatrists, and same with mental health nurses, and the same with GPs. So doctors. So it's definitely not about, you know, oh, it's men putting this down. It was definitely men that originally theorized these things, like the DSM and psychiatry, psychology, sociology, criminology. It's men for many, many years, you know, those original thinkers. And a lot of what they said was misogynistic. A lot of what they said was racist. A lot of what they said was homophobic. And then we've built on that instead of deconstructing it and starting again. So that's one of the issues. But then the other issue is actually a little bit more about the way that we try to understand human condition. So, you know, some of this stuff, the reason that all, you know, for example, psychiatrists and mental health students and doctors and stuff, they are all taught in the same way. They're all educated in the same way, that mental health is an illness. It's an illness inside the brain, and that it is up to the individual to be treated, to seek help, and to fix themselves or to recover. Whereas for me as a psychologist, my position is that these forms of suffering are not inside the head of people, they're in society, and like you say, these external influences all the time. But you know, I teach on those programs, and I'm often one of the only lecturers that says this that I'm saying right now, because the majority of all of these professionals have been taught that all of these people they're seeing have an innate mental illness, whereas obviously I don't believe that to be true.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. And I think once we get into our conversation about, you know, the word toxicity and gaslighting again, I think it'll be really, really interesting to divulge a bit more into that. But before we do, I'd love to know, I know you spoke about how the women and girls that you were working with in the courts and everything, they were super inspiring for you, and they were a huge turning point in your life into wanting to go into the field you're in now. But who else are your biggest inspirations? Who do you look to inspire you, and who sort of motivates you?
Oh, that's really difficult, because there's just been so many different, there's been so many like different people over the years. And definitely when I was younger, because I didn't really have any role models around me, most of my inspirations were authors. So, because I read so many books, and I definitely feel that, and I've said this before when people have interviewed me, Mallory Blackman really changed the way I look at the whole world. She wrote the Noughts and Crosses trilogy, and recently the BBC made it into a drama series. And I had the privilege.
I watched this. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
okay. Right.
It was
awesome.
Fantastic. Really good. Yeah.
Incredible piece of work. I just rave about it. I feel like I've been raving about it since I was like 9 years old. I read those books when they were first released. So I would have been between maybe like 10 and 12 years old or something like that, maybe 9 and 12 years old. So she just tipped the world upside down and taught me just a whole other way of looking at the world and critical thinking at a very sensitive period in child development, which is around that age. And she really did I think, and I've had the privilege of talking to her about this, actually. I really do think that she shaped...
That's so cool, by the way.
Yeah, I know, trust me.
Yeah.
But I think she shaped a lot of my critical thinking skills as a child.
Yeah.
And I think that my critical thinking skills is what have carried me through to this day, and will for the rest of my life. And I think that came from her and her books and everything that I read from her. And then I think that there was a long time where I didn't really have any role models whatsoever. And I was trying to figure out what on earth I was supposed to be and how are you supposed to be and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I definitely got lost for many years, sort of not having anybody to look up to at all. But I do think that, there's been a lot of, like I say, sort of like authors, women in the public eye, people that I've just sort of looked at and thought, that's incredible, that's amazing. And I think that I'm lucky in a way that I'm not I don't have any, I don't have a jealous streak. You know how some people look at women that are really successful and they get mardy and they get like resentful?
Yeah.
I've not got that, and I've never had it, and I don't know why. It's just not there. So when I see a woman that's doing amazing, I just think, oh my God, that's so cool. And I get all excited and stuff. And I just think, imagine how much work she's put in. Imagine how well she's doing. Imagine how much she's put into that. And I've always been like that. So I think that's always inspired me. When I see a woman that's done something amazing or written something amazing or she's worked really hard at it, it just gives me loads of energy. That's where my energy comes from.
That's so beautiful.
I think it's quite different.
It is very different. And I know you've done some work as well about women struggling to feel that towards other women, and women struggling to just have healthy relationships with other women, and the ability of women to hate other women for doing well. I think, some of the stuff you've written about that is really fascinating. But why do you think this is sort of the way that you feel? And, could you tell us a bit more about how women can have that competitive edge against other women and why we might feel like that? Do you think that's to do with internalized misogyny, or do you think that kind of leads into our conversation that we're about to have about toxic masculinity?
I think that it is internalized misogyny, but I also think that the patriarchy and toxic masculinity is such that it is set up to pit women against each other. We are supposed to be, by design, in this society, we are supposed to be at loggerheads. We are not supposed to work together, because if we work together, we would end up as powerful, if not much more powerful than the current patriarchy and historic patriarchy. But we are kept separated, and we are pitted against each other for really superficial shit, like what we look like, or, like how sexy we are, or who fancies us, or I don't know, like whatever it is, right? So there's a real advantage to keeping women hating each other. There really is. And, you see that on a micro level, but you also see that on this huge level. Like what really fascinates me, because I'm a huge, huge hip hop fan and have been forever, is that, there's all I think if you're a hip hop fan, or if you're listening to this, you'll know exactly what I'm about. Like you're going to know what I mean when I say this.
Yeah.
There's only allowed to be one leader, female MC at any one time, right? Otherwise, they will pit a woman against her. So, for example, like when Nicki Minaj is at the top of her game, they will deliberately go out and find someone, and they won't let them work together. Oh no. Because that's too easy, isn't it? They'll pit them against each other, and they'll turn it into beef that didn't exist, and they'll start rumors, and there'll be shit cracking off, and there's all this beef and stuff. So it's deliberate. Imagine what would happen if, for example, women in that industry were allowed to collab, work together, support each other, but that's not allowed to happen. Whereas the men are collabing all the time, doing it constantly. The women, it's like there's only allowed to be one. There's only allowed to be one. And you see that in other industries as well, and in other parts, of social life. Like there can only be, sort of one, like almost like alpha female. And then everyone else gets...
Like Meghan Markle and Kate Middleton, I suppose, as well. I mean, everyone's pitting them against each other. And I've heard, this is just, salacious gossip, but someone I work with said that she went to the royal wedding and stuff, and it's actually Harry and Will that have beef with each other, but the media makes it all about Meghan, and whether that's true or not. But I mean, they do make this rivalry between them, when it's like, why does there have to be a rivalry? Why can't they both just coexist and it's not a thing?
That's really interesting because that again is that sort of level of misogyny where it's so much more almost like juicy, and they know that it's women reading this shit as well. So like it's women reading about women's beef with each other. Whereas if they sort of reported that, I don't know, like two men are arguing or two men are falling out, people would be like, so sort of like,
I think this is so prevalent in toxic friendships as well. And I know earlier we spoke about how the word gaslighting has become something of a buzzword, and, you know, it's thrown around on social media and people might not even really understand what they're saying when they say that. And I feel like toxic is sort of a word that is used similarly to that. So I was super interested to ask you how you think the popularization of these terms like gaslighting and toxic, how do you think that's had an impact on survivors and just society in general? And do you think it's more positive or more negative?
Oh, that's such a good question. The thing is about that is that the more you neutralize and minimize terms that are important for description, they eventually become watered down until they mean nothing. And then they are seen as just, like you say, just like buzzwords. Nobody really understands them. People just throw them around. You know, I get the same thing with trauma informed. So like, you know, I'm trying to make what we do trauma informed and anti-pathology. And then you get people throwing that around. They've got no idea what they're talking about. They just say it. And it's the same with toxic. It's definitely the same with gaslighting. And I'll tell you my other one, my bugbear, narcissistic. Oh my gosh, am I sick of hearing, they're narcissistic. They've got, my narcissistic ex, and she's a narcissist. Oh, she's obviously.
Or OCD.
Oh, I know.
When people say, I'm just a bit OCD. Well, what do you mean you're a bit OCD? Like, it's a like a diagnosis. Like, you can't just be a bit something. Like, you either are or you aren't. And people just say it when, like, they like to have a tidy desk.
I think, and
that's not what it means.
I think some of this as well, although this is quite, we would end up down a rabbit hole if we end up talking about this. Some of this is about identity and identity politics, because in a society that is individualistic, it will rely and lean on identity. And one of the things that has definitely happened is that people are starting to identify with labels. So they're identifying even with things like that. So rather than saying, you know, I'm a very tidy person, I like everything just so, and I don't like a mess, they're going, I am OCD, or I am compulsive, or I am this. So like it's the labeling of sort of identifying into a label that, you know, means something to them. And it's the same with like gaslighting, narcissism, you know, and toxic and all that sort of stuff. And it really does water it down so that when you need to talk about that in its true sense, it is then almost meaningless.
It's difficult as well to find new words to describe things. Like, those words were created with purpose, and they stemmed from things that actually had real meaning. Yeah. But when, like you said, when they get watered down, like, how do you find the words to, you know, really encapsulate someone's experience when those words have sort of been taken and just commodified, or, you know, used on TikTok a million times with a million videos of people saying they have narcissistic personality disorder or something, when it just takes so much away from people who actually have had those experiences.
Yeah, definitely.
My next question was for you is, so I think the term toxic masculinity, it's something that makes men reel as soon as they hear it. It gets quite a negative response, and it feels like, I think men respond quite negatively to it because they instantly think that it's an attack. But I'd love to hear from you, what do terms like toxic masculinity and machismo actually mean? And what do they mean to you? Because I think it's interesting to unpick them, because, as I said, they get quite a negative response, but they're not a negative. I mean, they are about a negative concept, but also the way that they affect men is really interesting as well. So I just want to hear from you about that.
Oh yeah, 100%. So the thing is about toxic masculinity is that people hear that, and do you know what they hear when you say toxic masculinity? They hear toxic men.
Yeah.
They can't separate they can't separate the concepts, because when we talk about toxic masculinity, what we're talking about is a set of sort of beliefs, attitudes and behaviors that men are indoctrinated into as well from birth. So toxic masculinity is therefore that sort of form of the masculine gender role built on things like aggression, strength, power, control, being, for example, like no emotion, no empathy, stuff like that. And then that gender role becoming so embedded and so powerful that it becomes toxic to everyone. It becomes toxic to the men living in that gender role and to the little boys that are being groomed into that gender role. It becomes toxic to the little girls that are dealing with that gender role in society. And obviously it becomes toxic and very dangerous for women and girls that are then victims of the behavior that stems from that role in society. Mm-hmm. And obviously with machismo, that sort of sense of being a man and being self-reliant, or being, like a pride of being an exaggerated version of masculinity. And actually I did some, I wrote some stuff about machismo in like Latino culture, because I found that really fascinating, because it is linked to victim blaming. And so like that you're much more likely to victim blame women in those cultures when they've been subjected to male violence, because of this overarching culture of machismo that, is embedded into the fabric of everyday life. I think that, like I say, though, the reason that people don't take this conversation in is because they hear it as if I'm sat here saying all men are toxic, all men are dangerous, all men are, this, and that's not at all what is being said. But in a way, that's just a quick, easy way of trying to shut women up when they're trying to talk about things, is to like sort of twist what they say, oversimplify it, But I think toxic masculinity is also something I had an interest in like years ago. I did my, funnily enough, when I did my undergraduate degree, I did my dissertation on toxic masculinity.
Did you?
And I interviewed men about what they thought masculinity was and what it is to be a man.
Yeah.
And then I interviewed them about what is it to sort of play that role, and do you feel pressure to be a masculine man or not? And I interviewed men of different ages. I think the youngest was in his 20s and the oldest was in his 60s. And it was fascinating, some of the things that they said to me. And I'll never forget some of the comments that the older men made about saying that when you're down the pub, you're like, you have to play this masculine role and be like, my wife doesn't tell me what to do, and like I'll make her do the dishes, and I'm not cleaning the house, and this sort of stuff. And then like the men were saying to me, but we all know that when he goes home, he is cooking a Sunday roast with his wife, he is doing the dishes, he is doing these things,
and he likes it.
It's all a big game. Yeah, and he enjoys it. Yeah. So like one guy gave me an example of this man that he was in a pub with, and they ended up talking about Westlife. And about Westlife's album or something was in the charts or something like that. And all the men around the table were like, oh, Westlife is, they're petty, it's disgusting, they're so like pathetic, and it's women's music and all this sort of stuff. But like, at least a few of them knew that each other really liked Westlife. So and we had this fake conversation.
They're in the charts. Like that means people, like everyone's listening. It's not like it's the women's charts. Like people like it.
I know. And it really did fascinate me that, that was years ago. I was just an undergraduate student doing my psychology degree. But even the interviews with that, one of the men said to me, it's like living as two different people inside of yourself. The man you've got to show to everyone else, and like the man that I actually am. And like, don't get me wrong, some of them had some really deep embedded like views about what they thought masculinity was. Like, for example, one of the men said something like, I feel that masculinity means that I must provide for my family. I am the breadwinner. I'm responsible for everything. I've got to be the one that does everything. I've got to be the powerful one. I've got to be the controlling one. I've got to be the one that doesn't show emotion. I've got to be the rock. And I was sort of saying to him, does that not put an incredible amount of pressure on you? Yeah. And he was like, well, yes, but that's my role. But then I said, but what if you met a woman that was all those things as well? And that was where it broke down for him, because he didn't want a woman that was all those things. Like it was almost as if that would give him a rival. Yeah. And and that's how I think it becomes toxic.
God, that's so interesting. I feel like, it's usually in the context of talking about toxic masculinity, it's easy to speak about and get wrapped up in, the female experience of toxic masculinity, because I think, it is arguably a lot worse. But it's really interesting to look at the male side of it, just because I think a lot of men may not realize how toxic masculinity and living in a patriarchy negatively affects them. Because even if they're not sitting there thinking like, oh, I benefit from the patriarchy, this is great, blah blah blah, they're just enjoying what they know, and it's just the norm for their whole life.
They are.
But they're not looking at the negatives of it, and they see, as we said, the word toxic masculinity. They hear the words toxic men, and they're instantly like, well, you're just a feminazi, and you're just coming for me, and you want to take away my rights and all this sort of thing. But I find it so interesting, especially that you did your PhD about that, because it's just something that you don't really hear about as much, and it's super interesting.
Well, I didn't do a PhD on it. I purely just did a dissertation. So I actually did my PhD on the psychology of victim blaming of women and girls subjected to male violence, because I think actually, because I'm always sort of considering every angle, I do think that's made me a better psychologist, because, like you just said, men are, the best way to explain it, I think, is men are harmed by toxic masculinity and patriarchy, but women are oppressed, and that is different. So men benefit from these things and they're also harmed, but women are severely harmed and oppressed globally on a global scale. Billions of women are being harmed and oppressed. That is not the same as the harm that men, for example, millions and millions and millions of women will be raped this year across the world by men, right? Versus men saying things like, it's not fair, I should be able to show my emotions as well, and it's hard that men aren't allowed to cry. They're two completely different experiences. So it's not that I'm ignoring, it's not that I want to ignore men's experiences of toxic masculinity and patriarchy, but I do think that the impact on women is slightly more serious. So definitely. I focus on that. But you're right in that if you can understand that men were once tiny little babies with no knowledge of the world, they have been groomed into their roles by other grown-ups, by other people, by other children. You are born blank, essentially. Like I know this is a philosophical position to take, but I believe in a concept called tabula rasa, which means all humans are born blank. And that you become what's written on you. So every experience you ever have shapes who you become. And if you consider that from a very, very young age, little boys and little girls are groomed into their gender role, into who they are expected to be, how they are expected to behave, what they say, what they do, what they play with, how they dress, who they're allowed to be friends with, you are shaped, you are molded into what you become. And that's where toxic masculinity and also misogyny and femininity comes from.
Do you think there's such thing as toxic femininity? And what would you say that encompasses, if it does exist?
I think conceptually, yes, it exists. But I don't think it's anywhere near as powerful or systemic as toxic masculinity, in the same way that conceptually and theoretically misandry exists, but it's not anywhere near as systemic or powerful as misogyny. It has no power in a patriarchy. So I think that there are elements of, I think a lot of I think a lot of what is seen or thrown around, especially on the internet, of toxic femininity is actually just misogyny. It's just internalized and externalized misogyny.
That was one of my next questions, was about internalized misogyny. And that's more coming from females and, like you were saying, the roles that we're groomed into. Can you tell me what internalized misogyny means to you and how this can affect women without even realizing? I mean, in terms of things like body hair removal and those things that people just think, oh, I like to have smooth underarms because it makes me feel good. Or is that something that is told to us by the media because we live under a patriarchy? Anyway, I'd want to hear your thoughts on it. That's just me going on a bit of a
No. Okay, so for me, internalized misogyny is the absorption and then your own internalization and externalization of misogyny towards yourself as a woman and towards other women. So that can be anything from some of the superficial stuff like appearance, assuming that you have to look a certain way to be accepted in the world, that your worth comes from your appearance or from being thin or from being sexy, being desirable or whatever it is, but also then putting that on other women. and then sort of making comments about other women's bodies, making comments about like negative comments, or even bullying, harassing women for what they look like, how much they weigh, what they do. But it's much deeper than that superficial stuff. Like the superficial stuff is bad enough, but there's actually things like, for example, I work with a lot of internalized misogyny in professional settings, and what you'll find is that, say, for example, a woman's done really well and she becomes, I don't know, a director or a CEO. It won't just be the men that are making her life hard. It'll be the other women saying things like, well, she only got there because she shagged her way to the top. Like, who did she like give a blowjob to get there? And you think, what the hell is wrong with you? Like, if you are a woman in that setting with her, is that how you want to be treated at work? Like, no, it's not, is it? If you got to that role, would you be making comments like that? Like, you would be horrified if other people spoke about you like that. It's the sort of the assumption from other women that you are not capable, you are not as capable as a man, that a man would be doing a better job than you, that men are better than you. There's so much internalized misogyny around dating, around employment, around mental health, there's and just everything really, finances. Like for example, I'll give you a really interesting example of internalized misogyny that I see women do all the time.
Please do.
They're absolutely fine with men getting rich and being rich, and celebrities and like stuff like that. But women getting rich and being rich and spending money, and women like lose their heads on social media. Like, for example, like you've got sort of guys that are going out buying 6 Lamborghinis, 2 mansions, and like living it up. And that's like wealth and power, and it's amazing and it's success. But a woman goes out and spends, I don't know, 200 grand on a handbag, and everyone loses their minds. Like, how dare she? Why isn't she giving it to charity? And it's like, what?
People are out there like, laughing with Kanye West. Like, he's out there slandering people. He's having a mental breakdown all over Twitter. Like, we know he's in rehab. We know he's mentally ill. We know he needs help, but it's all just like fun and games, and he's rich and powerful and whatever. But then when someone like Amanda Bynes has a breakdown on Twitter, shaves her head, gets a face tattoo, all this, everyone's like, or like Cara Delevingne at the moment, we've seen her in the street
I've seen
on
the stuff,
TikTok.
with Cara,
it's absolutely heartbreaking to watch, and everyone's just like, can't believe this. Amy Winehouse 2.0, like, what a disgrace. And it just, the parallels there are so obvious when you look at wealth and power, whatever that even means, and celebrity. You can see it so clearly there.
Yeah, I agree. Although I don't agree that Kanye is mentally ill, and I don't think that any of them are having mental breakdowns. I actually think that it is not natural or normal to live like a celebrity. You have got no privacy. You are watched by millions of people 24 hours a day. You can't leave the house to go to a shop. You have no social life. People believe that being famous and being a celebrity is a barrel of laughs. It's not. You can't decide you're going to go out and see your friends because you'll get mobbed. You can't, you can't nip to the shop because you'll get mobbed. You live in your own little bubble because it's the only safe place to live anymore. And then you get papped somewhere, and then there's 6, different headlines lying about where you were and why you were there. And then you're getting phone calls constantly like, can you make a statement about this? Can you do this? Can you do this interview? Why have you done this? Why have you done that? And that's not normal. And the human brain is not developed to deal with that. That's not normal. And I think that what we actually see is people breaking through trauma, the absolute trauma of becoming like almost like a zoo animal, but for billions of people to watch,
Yeah, and maybe their response is normal for for a normal human going through something like that. Like,
it is. It's just not what people want it to be. So, like, for example, Kanye's responses, yes, they're offensive. Yes, they're harmful. Yes, they look really out of control. But if you consider the lifestyle and the way that the human brain will not cope with everything, and look at Cara, and also look at the amount of celebrities that kill themselves. They're taking overdoses. We know that lots of celebrities are taking hard drugs. They use it to cope. Loads of them are on sleeping tablets. They're taking sedatives every day because they can't sleep anymore. There's a reason why that's happening to them. It's not because they're all just mentally ill. That makes no sense. It's because they're living a life that is impossible to live safely.
Yeah.
So you become traumatized.
Another question I had was, how do you think internalized misogyny might be making women feel without consciously realizing it. So I know we spoke about in the workplace and financially and everything, but how do you think it makes women feel without realizing it? And what are some questions that people listening can ask themselves to help unpick any internalized misogyny they might not even know that they're experiencing?
Oh gosh, it depends. So there's two. So what you need to do when you're thinking about internalized misogyny is think about it almost in two different layers. So the first layer is the internalized misogyny that you use to attack yourself with. And then the second layer of your internalized misogyny is what you use to attack other women with. So you've got the messages that you give to yourself via internalized misogyny, like I'm not good enough, I'm fat, I'm disgusting, I'm not worth anything, I need to lose weight, I need to look better, I need to be young forever, I need to be thin, I need to be sexier. Like, why is nobody paying attention to me? I'm not good enough for this. I'm not clever enough. Like all that sort of stuff, right? Is that like internalized misogyny about, I don't know, things like, oh, I'm ashamed of how many people I've had sex with, or I shouldn't be doing this, or like ashamed about your sexuality, because all homophobia comes from misogyny. All homophobia has a root in misogyny. So, if you are struggling even with your own homophobia or with homophobia towards yourself, internalized homophobia, you'll find also internalized misogyny there, and often like other forms of bias, like internalized racism and things like that. But then you've got to look at the things that you do to other people, like the messages that you get about other people. Like, for example, when you see a woman that you perceive in some way to be better than you, do you jump to the defense, or do you attack her, or do you get jealous, or do you hope something bad happens to her, or are you secretly like happy when she starts struggling? Like, that's your misogyny kicking in. Like, what are you getting out of that? I read a quote recently that said, hating other women is like drinking your own poison and expecting them to die. And I really like that, because I think that's what happens. I think women that become hateful towards other women that they perceive as better or doing well or whatever it is that they don't like about them, that they're prettier or that, I don't know, they're more successful or whatever, that hatred is poisoning you as a woman. Your internalized misogyny is harming you. And that is changing your life. It's changing the way your brain works. It's changing your outcomes. It's changing your personality. It's not having the impact outside that it is having on yourself. So like processing your own internalized misogyny and your hatred for other women is one of the healthiest things you could do for yourself.
And how else do you combat it apart from recognizing it and challenging your own thoughts? And when those thoughts creep in, going like, hey, like that's not good enough, like I shouldn't be feeling that way. How do we challenge that? Like, would you recommend things like therapy, or would you recommend being open about it with your friends? Like, what would your first steps be to sort of, overcoming that and helping to be more accepting of other women and yourself?
I think talking to your other female friends is only a good idea if they are all on the same page as you. Because if you start having a conversation about, I don't know, say you're all sat around and you go, do you know what? I've been thinking recently that I actually have a lot of internalized misogyny. I feel like I hate a lot of women just for like no reason, and that I really hate scroll or whatever it is. I don't know. Like, so imagine you're sat doing that. The problem is, if you've got other women around you that are not ready for that conversation, all they will do is pull you back into your internalized misogyny, because it'll make them feel more comfortable. If you get like gossip, like pulled back into gossip, pulled back into, lying about someone or like mocking them or whatever, because if they're not ready for that challenge, they won't let you do it. Trust me.
Yeah. And they'll probably see it as an attack as well, in a way, because they might think, like, if you're saying I hate other women, they might be like, well, what? Do you hate me?
Yeah. You have to have the right person to talk to. I mean, obviously therapy is one way of doing that. But again, therapists are often misogynistic and have their own internalized misogyny. So you have to remember that therapists are not infallible. You are going to come across therapists that actually do harm or encourage you down ways of thinking that are actually not healthy for you, or they don't challenge you enough when they should be doing. So, I think that this is a journey that you have to go on almost on your own. Like, you have to, at the end of the day, these thoughts and behaviors that all of us exhibit, they're our own choices. They are. Like, you're not doing this because you're out of control of your mind. You're out of control of your own thoughts. It's just that you're not controlling them currently and you could be doing more.
Yeah.
So a lot of this work, I think, you do have to do on your own.
And maybe it's using resources like, obviously you've got your books that you've written. Do you have any other good resources that people who, you know, have related to this chat and think that they want to learn more about it? Is there anyone else who inspires you that does really great work in this field?
Oh, there's so many. I really love Laura Richards' work. Okay. She does the Crime Analyst podcast. She's specifically around cases where she picks them apart. But her like way of thinking about misogyny and internalized misogyny and pathologization is like so sharp. And
you know what? I honestly, I love having people like you on the podcast. Like, you're just so well informed, you're so knowledgeable. And I think even doing this podcast every week, I learn so much from people like you. So I think, yeah, just thank you so much for coming on and for having such an open and honest discussion. And I think everyone has a lot of work to do, so I'll put the resources in the episode description, and everyone you just mentioned as well, I'll pop a link in there. But thank you so much for jumping on the podcast, Jess. I hope you enjoyed my chat with the wonderful Jess. Please let me know on my Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, whatever, if you have any stories or thoughts of your own to share. Love and elbow taps. Peace.